Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of Justice Action Network's Unconventional series, which is a virtual event series that runs through Election Day and features lawmakers, advocates, businesses, directly impacted people, law enforcement leaders, and prosecutors, like our two panelists today, who work in support of criminal justice reform in various ways. Today's episode is titled Law and Order, Reforms from the Prosecutor's Perspective. And I'd first like to start by introducing our two esteemed panelists before we launch into discussion today. First, we have Rob Sanders, who's the Commonwealth's attorney for the 16th Judicial District of Kentucky. Rob and our executive director, Holly Harris, have worked closely on many projects over the last couple of years, and I know have shared a lot of fond memories. And second, we have Greg Rowe, who's Director of Legislation and Policy for the Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association. And similarly, I know Greg has spent time working with our Deputy Director, Jenna Bottler, previously Jenna Mall, on a number of issues in Pennsylvania as well. So we both, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Lauren.
Some broad overview questions about law and order and criminal justice reform generally. So today there are many on the right, or even who work within law enforcement or prosecutors' offices themselves, that say that we can either have law and order or criminal justice reform. And as two prosecutors who have worked with groups and lawmakers on some reform legislation, I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on that sentiment. Again, very broad question, be as broad or as narrow with your answers as you'd like. Greg, let's start with you.
Sure, thank you for having me, and that's a great question, and obviously very timely. I think my broad answer to the broad question is, I think we can have it both ways. I think nothing is mutually exclusive in this debate and in the reform space. I think we can improve outcomes in the criminal justice system because, reform is not, just changing sentencing laws. Reform is also looking at victim services. It's all of that. It's making the system better. It's making it more efficient. It's saving tax dollars. And ultimately, in a lot of cases, trying to reinvest that money back into the system to let us do more programs and to have better reentry services, which will in turn make our communities even safer. So I would say the two aren't mutually exclusive. And in fact, we should be excited about improving the system because ultimately that will help law enforcement and victims of crime.
Absolutely. Rob, care to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think we're going to talk a lot about improved outcomes, and ultimately I think it comes down to just improving the justice system. I hate it when people say that we have a broken justice system. I don't think it's broken, but at the same time I don't think it's perfect either. So I think it's a naive approach to say that we can have law and order or we can have justice reform. I think the smarter, more intelligent sentence from either side, regardless of what your perspective is that we can have a better justice system. And I think ultimately that's what, at least from my opinion, what criminal justice reform comes down to is having a better justice system. That doesn't always mean less punishment for criminals. It, in my mind, means better outcomes for everyone involved. It means fewer cases for my prosecutors to have to prosecute, fewer crime victims in my community, and overall an improved quality of life when there's less crime victims in my community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I don't think anybody likes having a caseload as large as some prosecutors do. They don't want to see the same people kind of coming through again and again and again. So I think both of your responses were really, really great on touching on that point. So just kind of piggybacking on that, how do you both see the role of the prosecutor fitting into the broader goals of improving outcomes in our criminal justice system, right? Or is there a role to play? I think a lot of people recognize that prosecutors, they carry a lot of power in how they prosecute individuals, in the outcome of the case. Their decisions do weigh heavily on what actually happens to a person who is involved in the justice system. But a lot of people just kind of think of them as their role as being just kind of that, the people who prosecute. I'm wondering if you both can touch on whether you think prosecutors can finish the broader goals of improving outcomes beyond, just kind of prosecuting cases.
I think we definitely can. I mean, the bottom line is we have a lot of control over a lot of variables in the system, and I think especially when it comes to the smaller cases, the lower level cases, that we can at least keep one eye on the ultimate outcome. For instance, in Kentucky, if a defendant gets 2 convictions, they can't get expungement under limited circumstances. Can you get 2 convictions expunged? But if you have 2 offenses committed on different days that are technically unrelated to one another, you can't get the second one expunged. So ultimately, if you want to motivate a defendant to have a good outcome, to follow their probation and parole directives, and to be successful, you can double the punishment on one, but only give them 1 conviction so that ultimately they'll have an opportunity to get that felony erased and hopefully have better job opportunities in the future when they get their addiction issues cleared up, when they stop breaking the law, and hopefully they stay out of trouble for quite some time. And that's one instance of a prosecutor. Does it really matter whether we have 2 felony convictions versus 1 conviction and the same amount of punishment, and give that defendant an opportunity to have an employable future sometime down the road?
I agree with Rob completely. I think prosecutors not only have a role, but should be leading in that role. The job of a prosecutor is so different now than it was a decade, certainly 20 years ago. A prosecutor does not just try cases or supervise those who try cases. I think one of the areas where prosecutors have led and can and should continue to lead is in the area of diversion, right? There are many different diversion programs. Some are for the most low-level crimes, and some are for some far more serious ones. And I think when you have a prosecutor who's looked at the data and who's examined it, who's looked at the cohort group that's at issue, who's worked with the victims and made sure there's victim input, that can really advance diversion and ensure not only that there's perhaps a shorter sentence or an avoided sentence, but there's the right programming out there. That there's an analysis of the data, and we're not just sort of putting somebody into a program and calling it a day, but actually holding people accountable, holding fellow government employees who are running some of these programs accountable as well. So that's a space for prosecutors. And the last thing on this is, I think a good example, certainly in Pennsylvania, was toward the beginning of the opioid crisis and naloxone. Our association, working closely with obviously our members, worked really hard to get grants and to push out naloxone throughout our communities. And that just made a heck of a difference when it came to saving lives. Beginning of the crisis, if anybody had said, "Oh, prosecutors are going to be leading the way," I don't think people would have believed it. But that's been an important leadership role for prosecutors.
That's very interesting. And just piggybacking on that, I know, and I appreciate those answers. I'm also, because I work on our state team on legislation, that's kind of where my head is at. I'm also wondering if you have had some success in going to local legislators and kind of voicing your opinions on certain things and whether or not that has changed their opinion. Because I think a lot of people, when they think of prosecutors and those who are active in legislation, they might just be opposed to everything. That's what I think the traditional mindset is. In our experience, I mean, clearly we've worked with you two on some of this stuff to create better outcomes in your states. I'm wondering if you've been able to change some minds or get people thinking about how not all prosecutors think in the same way, and if that has been influential as well.
Go ahead, Greg.
Sure. Couple of thoughts. Great question again. A couple of thoughts. I think not only on the state legislative level, but on the local level. And let me, people who've heard me, people I work with, is something I say a lot, but I can't say it enough. One of the challenges of trying to do more diversion and more programming is that it sometimes at the outset costs more, right? Because you have to have a dedicated EA and somebody oftentimes from social services and a long-term treatment bed to get that individual the treatment that he or she needs, so as not to be a recidivist after release, or just to avoid incarceration at all. the front end, that costs more. At the back end, you save so much money and you've improved lives and kept families together. But you got to spend a little to get a lot. And that's been one of the points that we've made, again, not just at the state level, but individual DAs at the local level, as well as emphasizing that for drug and alcohol treatment and mental health treatment and the treatment for co-occurring disorders, you can't do a fly-by-night quick little dip into a treatment program. It has to be sometimes residential, but certainly long-term, because that's ultimately going to get to the criminogenic needs. So that's been a common theme that we've pushed. I think, sure, some people are surprised that we're advocating for, such robust treatment in lieu of incarceration, or perhaps for shorter incarceration. But I think the message has certainly been heard. But it is hard to get funding, particularly in these times, to achieve those successes.
Mhm.
I think we definitely increase our credibility with legislators when we're not constantly against everything. That's, looking for common ground and improving things for the entire system, finding portions of bills, criminal justice reform bills that are put forward that we don't necessarily object to or that doesn't cause problems for a prosecutor, and being in favor of those. I think that changes legislators' approach and improves prosecutor credibility, so that when we do go to the legislature and say, you cannot do this, or you've got to do this, or we have to be able to do that, I've found that the legislators are far more receptive if they know that you're a reasonable prosecutor, that you're not just against everything. We've tried that approach in Kentucky, and it has been, I don't want to say totally unsuccessful. We've been successful in blocking a lot of things that we didn't like in the past, but we were starting to see that ability to block everything erode. And we had to change our approach so that we didn't have really bad changes to Kentucky law because we were against everything. So, and that's where I think I've had success, that the legislature is building that reputation, that credibility, and that trust with the legislators to know that if Rob's going to come to us and say, this is a bad idea, it really is. Because when it's not a bad idea, when it really isn't something we have a problem with, I'm going to tell them that too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And why I like working with prosecutors like the two of you is because when lawmakers hear, oh, I'm not necessarily against this, the arguments about law and order versus criminal justice reform kind of disappear, and the arguments again become more about the actual policy. You're actually able to focus, like, is this good policy? Is this going to make my state, my local jurisdiction better and smarter? And it's always really appreciated when we have people come to the table in good faith like that. So
I think it can also help criminal justice reform groups as well. That's one of the reasons that Jan has had so much success, is because somebody like Holly will come to town and say, okay, Rob, what part of this can you live with? What part do you agree with? What part can you be for? And then tell me which ones really give you heartburn. And if we can hammer out a middle ground that we can both accept, that the reform groups have a lot more success if they can say, hey, the prosecutors aren't opposing this, or even the prosecutors are on board with this. It works. It improves lives for everybody involved.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually a good segue, because my next question is about some state specific issues. So just turning back to you, Rob, I mean, you talk about how you've worked with advocates and you have supported some of these issues. And so I was wondering if you can talk about, I know you've worked with on issues related to addiction and second chances, which you've kind of briefly mentioned here earlier. Can you talk about your work on these issues and kind of show how you have worked with unlikely allies in the state?
Sure. We started a program. The most unlikely ally ever that I teamed up with was a criminal defense attorney at the time here in the community, who had been a criminal defense attorney for 30 years. His name's Burr Travis. I actually brought him into my office to work with me because he and I had come up with an idea for what we now call the HEART program, which was Heroin Expedited Addiction Recovery and Treatment. And the idea was to take defendants, and rather than make them sit in jail and sit in custody, which they were doing because so many were overdosing and dying that the judges quit giving them bonds that they could afford, Burr and I had the idea to get these folks out of jail and into treatment on the front end of their case, so that by the time we got to sentencing, they could prove to the judge that they were a viable candidate for diversion or probation, that they had been in treatment, they had been clean, rather than coming to sentencing and saying, Judge, I haven't had an option at treatment yet. I know this is my third conviction, but I've never had an opportunity to go to treatment. And that was the first one, and had great success with that. The HEART program saved the county millions of dollars in pretrial incarceration costs. It's given, I don't know how many hundred defendants now, probably into the thousands of defendants now, opportunities for drug treatment that they hadn't had previously. Also have teamed up with groups from the ACLU on some women's dignity issues that I know Jan was involved with. Also, on the first go round in Kentucky, and we're getting ready to go forward with a second bill on women's dignity issues. We've worked with a number of different groups that across the board on expungement issues to make, felony expungement was coming to Kentucky, whether prosecutors liked it or not. And we worked with about every different reform group in Frankfurt, which is our state capital, in order to make an expungement bill that worked for everyone. That we have some offenses, the lowest level offenses, that are automatic expungements. If somebody applies for it, they're eligible, they get it. And then we broadened that more recently to include all Class D felonies, which is our lowest level felony in Kentucky. But we did give prosecutors an opportunity to object on certain offenses, because there are some low-level offenses that are actually very violent, very concerning offenses, or maybe that a prosecutor had negotiated a plea resolution to prior to the existence of expungement. And now we were concerned that somebody might get a very serious offense, albeit low level, wiped off their record. We found a middle ground. We made it happen. Now, Kentucky's come light years in terms of the things that have been improved, from access to drug treatment, getting defendants out of jail on the front end rather than the back end of the cases, on women's dignity issues, and on expungement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it's just been amazing, just as an outsider, to see the amount of work that you guys have been able to get done in such a short amount of time. Really appreciate working with you as a partner and others that you mentioned. And Greg, I know that Jenna, she sings your praises when it comes to being a good friend and partner on reform issues that have passed in Pennsylvania, even when there's disagreements. So can you talk about some of the work you've done with advocates on issues in Pennsylvania, like clean slate and driver's license suspension reform? Because I know the situation in Kentucky and Pennsylvania are very different, but
right.
Very similar approach, I think, from your perspective. Would love to hear about it.
Sure, I'd love to talk about a clean slate. Pennsylvania is rarely the first state to enact anything on any topic, but we often do it, but it takes a little while. Clean slate was the exception. So clean slate is essentially automatic record sealing of certain offenses after a period of that an individual does not have any convictions. So a lot of detail that goes into it, but basically this is a jobs bill that Justice Action Network led the charge on with other advocates, with a wonderful bipartisan coalition of Democrats and Republicans in the House and in the Senate, pushing it really hard. The theory is pretty straightforward, that this automatic record sealing is going to help formerly incarcerated or people with records get jobs. And Jenna and Holly approached me about it, and approached a couple of electeds, and we met and we talked. And for us, it was a great coalition. Yes, we went through the crimes code and we looked at certain crimes and said, yeah, this may be graded as a misdemeanor. You know what? It often has a sexual assault component to it. Maybe we ought not include that one. But like everything else on the page, absolutely works. So let's, after 10 years, if there have been no convictions, make sure that there's no public access or employer access. And the employer community was greatly in favor of this, because it helped with their liability issues, and they could hire people with records, not having to fear, God forbid something went wrong, that they would get sued. From our point of view, what we did is we worked a lot on the language, and that's where Jen and I spent a lot of time really hammering with legislative staff, like the individual words, the individual crimes, really just sort of the craftsmanship. And then we also did on the PR front. We were sort of the lead law enforcement group that I think people saw it and said, oh, the DAs of Pennsylvania not only are okay with it, they actually actively support it. And we had very, our talking points were fairly straightforward, but I think resonated, and I jotted them down. I mean, we essentially said over and over, clean slate means jobs, and jobs mean good reentry, and good reentry means less recidivism, and less recidivism means increased public safety. Therefore, clean slate means increased public safety. So, we had versions of that we said at every rally and every press conference, and I think it resonated. And I think it was important to have that working relationship with you all, to be able to be candid about certain crimes, and also be able to say, yeah, we're with you. We're going to stand with you on this, because at the end of the day, this is a phenomenal bill that's going to let people get jobs. And we did it. What's interesting is we found shortly thereafter, some of the advocates actually found that being first has a disadvantage. You're first, so you notice a couple of things you could have done better. One of the things that was in the bill is you had to have paid your fines and fees and restitution before you could get your record, before your record would be automatically sealed. Restitution is one thing, and you got to pay your restitution. Fines and fees is very different. So we have worked with Jan and other groups on a bill that we are hopeful will get to the governor's desk during this last couple of weeks of session, that would waive the fines and fees requirement. And as a result, if this passes, thousands and thousands and thousands of people will get the benefit of clean slate. So it's been a recurring relationship as we have the comfort level of just working so closely together for the same goal. Same thing with the driver's licenses. We just really reduced the types of crimes that would lead to an automatic suspension of your driver's license. And we were there at the beginning, great coalition of groups, and that's now the law of the land in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's great. And both of your answers are just kind of underscore the fact that you're putting lives above, just bureaucracy and certain laws. And I feel like you're able to put those politics aside and really kind of dive into supporting ideas that are going to make and policies that are going to make your states better. And so I really appreciate the perspective that you both just shared from your respective states. But just kind of following up on that, I know that not all, you can't paint advocates, prosecutors, police with a broad brush. They don't all believe the same things, but I'm curious that as you all have gotten engaged on some of these issues, have you inspired others in your state to start to see things differently on some reform issues? Of course, that's a very broad question, so you can answer it however you'd like to. But I'm just curious if you've inspired other prosecutors and law enforcement to start looking at these and seeing, maybe I should come to the table, or maybe I should see if there's a way that we can improve this through your work. And do you think that more prosecutors in your state should be willing to come forward and support some of this stuff? It's kind of a two-part question, but.
I think it's shown that, let me preface this by saying, I am, and Holly will vouch for me on this, I am not a soft on crime prosecutor by any stretch of the imagination. I've established what I'd like to believe is a reputation, not only in my community, but statewide, as very pro law enforcement, very tough on crime. I like to save the prison space for the worst of the worst offenders, the people that I became a prosecutor to go after, the rapists, the robbers, the child molesters, the murderers. Those are the people that I really want to spend my time prosecuting. Those are the people that I really want to make my community safe by taking them off the streets and putting them in prison where they belong. That said, I've also been reasonable and open to criminal justice reform and improving the system. And I think that what other prosecutors have seen is that you can be in favor of common sense criminal justice reform without taking away from your own reputation as a very good prosecutor, and even as a very tough on crime prosecutor. That maybe in the past, where they have seen stereotypically prosecutors are supposed to be against everything, prosecutors are supposed to be about as many convictions, as high as a conviction rate as you can get, and putting as many people in prison as possible. And now they're starting to see, well, wait a second, I don't have to be all of those things in order to still be viewed as a tough on crime prosecutor. And ultimately, I think that my reputation as being a tough on crime prosecutor is one of the reasons that when I tell, whether it's legislators or law enforcement or whoever, that, hey, wait a second, this reform makes sense. This is why we can do this. This is why this is a good idea, that they're open and receptive to it, because they know that I'm not about to do anything or endorse any change that's going to put my community at risk.
I think the programs, the successful programs and changes to law sell themselves. And that really, I think the value of of, those of us in this world working so hard on trying to get good reform laws changed or passed, and frankly, trying to meet in the middle on a lot of these things and come to an agreement on a bill that will make a positive impact. I think when you look at the results and ultimately analyze the data, nothing can sell a reform better than the results. And I think prosecutors are starting to look at data more. Part of it is because budgets are tight, and you got to be able to justify, what you're doing, and data is an important part of that. And I think Rob makes a great point. Like there's crime to fight. There are enough murderers and rapists and domestic abusers. Unfortunately, there are plenty of them, and we better make sure there's space in the state prisons for them. And when folks try to reduce their sentences, that's where we say, well, no, we're not up for that. But we're looking at others, particularly when there are addiction issues, and we know they're going to get out at some point, probably sooner rather than later. We better be looking at our system, and I think that draws prosecutors, in addition to the reasons that were updated.
Yeah, and I think, just being able and willing to come to the table and talk about it is influential to others, and will get them starting to think like, oh, maybe there are better outcomes that we can be advocating for in certain ways. So I appreciate those responses. Now, shifting gears to a really, really tough, I mean, it's been tough for everybody, this pandemic, but especially tough for local jurisdictions who are having to quickly react and protect, the populations in their prisons and jails. I wanted to shift gears and kind of talk about the impact COVID has had in your states and local jurisdictions. A lot of you guys have had to scramble and react and try to prevent a deadly outbreak. Can each of you talk about how your states or counties or, whatever you want to talk about, focus in on, have reacted to the outbreak, and what kind of results have you seen? Rob, I'll start with you.
Well, our reaction is very different throughout Kentucky, depending on what county you're talking about. We have 120 different counties in Kentucky. Not all of them have their own detention facilities. Some of them share detention facilities, or else contracted out to another county that has a detention facility. Largely, it's been dependent upon the local prosecutor. I was one who was extremely alarmed about COVID, especially at the onset when nobody knew exactly what COVID was going to be, what it was going to look like, what it was going to mean to a detention facility. The one thing that we did know for sure, though, is that communities that were contained, that didn't have the option of social distancing, that didn't have the opportunities to sanitize hands or wash as much as they might like, things like that, those were high risk environments. And that's, I think, the one thing about coronavirus that's definitely played out to be accurate and correct, is that any community that is contained, like our nursing homes, like our detention facilities, those are the ones where we were exposed to the highest risk of outbreak, to the highest risk of bad outcomes, which I took that as a call to, let's go through our population, our jail population, literally went through it line by line, spent countless hours looking at Excel spreadsheets of every prisoner that we had in our jail. Why are they there? And can we afford to let that person out? Can we do it safely without putting the community at risk? And when it's some of these low-level nonviolent offenders that maybe they had screwed up their probation and they were paying the price for that screw up, can we afford to let them pay that price a little bit later? Maybe, let them out of jail for a few months, see how this coronavirus thing is going to play out, and then we can bring them back into the court system. At that time, decide whether they need to go back into the jail, or whether maybe they got back on the right track and took advantage of this opportunity to prove to the court that they didn't need to be in the jail in the first place. Some people did. Some people did not. Lots of people didn't show back up for court and now have warrants out for their arrest. But at the onset, in the first 3 months of the pandemic, we cut our jail population by 55%, well over 300 inmates that were released. And we did that in a number of different ways. We started with the pretrial inmates. We then went to the ones that were in on probation or violations, and it eventually moved on to ones that were actually serving state sentences but were eligible for shock probation. And I think, ultimately it made sense for taxpayers. I got very mixed feedback on some folks that didn't think it was a good idea to be emptying out the jail population as much as possible because of coronavirus, until I started talking about the fact that, well, aside from your feelings on the coronavirus, if one of them does get sick and if one of them has to go to the hospital, the taxpayers have to pay those medical bills. And God forbid one of them ends up in ICU or on a ventilator, the taxpayers have to foot the bill for that. And that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars for one patient. And if we have multiple inmates end up in ICU or on ventilators, that could be millions of taxpayer dollars going to inmate medical bills, not to mention taking up space in the hospital that you or your loved one, your family might need if you, God forbid, come down with coronavirus. And now all of a sudden people's minds started to go, wait a second, he's got a point there. Okay, I don't want to have a drug possessor or a shoplifter or something like that, eating up my tax dollars with their medical bills. They started to come around to the fact so ultimately it's been successful. We have had, it took several months. I don't think we had our first case of coronavirus in our detention facility until August of this year, but a lot of things have changed since then. Most notably, I think our medical field is much more adept at handling coronavirus. They have a much better handle on exactly what coronavirus is, what it can and can't be treated with, what's successful, and how much risk is an individual at, depending on their comorbidities and things like that. So it really had a huge positive outcome, and I think saved our county potentially millions of dollars in medical bills.
Yeah, I mean, it was just amazing to see how quickly you all acted after this kind of started sweeping the nation. So it's very, very interesting results for sure. Greg, wondering if you can provide the perspective of what happened in Pennsylvania, what you saw.
Similar. And let me just talk about a case we jumped in on as an association to sort of back up a lot what Rob's experience in Kentucky. There were petitions filed by those who wanted a lot of people to be released from county jails. From our point of view, way too much violent offenders, users, all that sort of stuff. And we filed an opposition brief. But one of our exhibits was about all the measures that various different counties had already taken to reduce the general population in county jails. And so I use this example just to say we've had so many counties that were at their lowest level in decades to try to allow the county wardens to get social distancing going and just to reduce the population overall. And we were able to cite to that, and the court actually agreed with us and mandated a process to allow petitions to be filed, but not to mandate a result, which was good with us because everyone is allowed to petition, but we were able to talk about just what different counties have done, which is, again, along the lines of what Rob talks about, getting out probation violators, local parole violators, people who are nearing the end of their sentences, who are going to get out in a month anyway, and just resulted in really some low numbers, and I think some lessons learned going forward on how to maybe achieve long-term reductions in the local population. On the state level, we worked with our corrections secretary, John Wetzel, on a piece of legislation that did not make it, unfortunately, but that would have established a program, again, of less violent offenders and allowing the DOC to identify them to be released temporarily. And it had our support. And while it didn't pass, the secretary and the governor ultimately used the model that we came up with through an executive order that allowed Secretary Wetzel to release these individuals even for a defined period of time. So we really stepped up, I think, and we didn't object. Individual DAs didn't object to a lot of the people that Secretary Wetzel put forward, and he was able to reduce his population in certain prisons to minimize the effect.
That's great. And I could talk to you guys for much longer. I know we're running up against time here, but I just have one more question, and a very important one. So I want to make sure that we can spend a little bit of time on this. Rob, you participated in Jan's federal emergency COVID task force that we convened several months ago now, with a number of different criminal justice stakeholders. I guess we can paint them with a broad brush. And I know you've been having conversations around additional federal funding for jurisdictions who have been working hard to appropriately react to this unprecedented pandemic, as well as organizations that are providing essential services, during this time, who are threatened to shut down. Can you talk about the needs that Kentucky is facing right now, on this, that you would like to see in a COVID relief package? And Greg, I'll just, for time, if you can think of anything like federal funding that could be used in your state, that comes to mind, would love to hear your thoughts, and we'll wrap up after this. So.
Well, we basically shut down our court system entirely for 3 months, with the exception of a few Zoom dockets for incarcerated inmates pre-trial, but really weren't getting much of anything, certainly weren't trying cases. Shut it down completely for 3 months, then opened it up for the next 3 months to very limited amounts of dockets, but still weren't trying cases. As a result, we've got a gigantic backlog in Kentucky. The very first thing we could really use is federal funding that would provide for more personnel, just really the bodies to handle these cases and try and clear out these backlogs. And that's not just prosecutors. It is prosecutors, but it's also public defenders, it's judges, it's the court staff, it's the jail staff, it's the sheriff's deputies that are needed for court security, it's the sheriff's deputies that are needed for the added difficulties of getting people in and out of the courthouse while still dealing with COVID precautions and distancing and asking people questions about whether they've been sick, things like that. It's the law enforcement that's been burning the candle at both ends, trying to go out and find the people that are not showing back up for court and getting them to come back to the courthouse. It's the law enforcement that's been trying to keep people safe, that's been dealing with an uptick in drug use, overdoses, domestic violence. I'm sure that we're going to have just an explosion of child victim cases. And when I'm talking child victim cases, I'm mostly talking child sexual assault cases. Once children are back into schools and back into places where they can report, where they can tell an adult what has happened to him or her while they've been at home, we need the people to handle these cases. Another big thing we need is the treatment providers. Talk about burning the candle at both ends. They've been doing everything they can to partner with the justice system to keep people alive, to keep them off drugs as best as possible while we get their case back through while we got the justice system restarted, get their case back into court. They are doing everything they can to treat people, whether it's Zoom meetings, group Zoom meetings, or if it's in person with PPE and all kinds of distancing precautions and things like that. They need help. One of the biggest problems we've had is people not showing back up for court, and our jail population is slowly but surely creeping back up because we have very limited resources in what we are doing, how we are monitoring people that are out, and how we can go find them and get them back into court without arresting them and putting them right back into our detention center and filling it right back up. Our ankle monitoring capabilities with our detention center is about maxed out. The court system, in terms of its pretrial monitoring, is about maxed out. These are all things that if we had a criminal justice component to any coronavirus relief bill, those are problems that, it wouldn't be an overnight cure. It wouldn't be a magic bullet, but it would go a long way towards helping to fix these problems in the criminal justice system and get everybody through the system, get the cases resolved, get the people into treatment that need treatment, get the justice for the victims in the major cases, get those cases to trial. Those are all things that I think we can accomplish with a little more investment, a little more assistance.
Absolutely. Greg?
Rob said it all. To say domestic violence, child abuse, child sexual exploitation, treatment, and diversion. I mean, those are just areas that are unfortunately screaming for some help. And as the funds just aren't necessarily going to be there for, particularly in our cities and counties, if we don't fund treatment, if we don't make sure we're at least flat funded where we were last year, the jail and prison population is just going to increase. If our diversion, domestic violence programs, If our child abuse programs and experts there aren't funded, we're just going to see victims hurt and re-victimized even more. So I think those are the key areas.
Yeah, 100%. And Jan has been working tirelessly at the federal level trying to advocate for these reforms in any COVID relief package, and hope that federal lawmakers in the White House are listening, because these are funds that are desperately needed, especially if we're thinking about just preventing another outbreak. I mean, as populations are going up and you guys have all these problems that you're dealing with, you also, on top of that, have to deal with, potential outbreak again. So anyway, not to end on a sort of ominous note there, but I think that's just, I mean, like I said, I could keep talking to you guys for a while, but I really, really appreciate your time. I hope that those who are listening, who may have had a different perspective on how prosecutors work, have been able to see that there's really good work that's being done by all sorts of folks out there when you come to the table and you put politics aside and you just work on the policy. And there's so much more that needs to be done through the federal funding for our local jurisdictions. And so really appreciate the time that you guys have taken out of your days to speak with us. And really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.